Each of us all across this great land has a stake in maintaining and improving environmental quality. Clean air and clean water, the wise use of our land, the protection of wildlife and natural beauty, parks for all to enjoy. These are part of the birthright of every American. To guarantee that birthright, we must act, and act decisively.
The Endangered Species Act, signed by President Richard Nixon, turned 50 years old in December, marking half a century of federal management and protection of specific species that are experiencing unprecedented decline. Daily Interlake reporter Kate Heston is bringing you a 4-part series on the ESA, taking a comprehensive look at the species most at risk in northwest Montana, how the legal process outlined in the law has helped some bounce back from near extinction, and what it means when the lines between federal and state protections for animals becomes blurred.
Ecologists describe the sturgeon as a living dinosaur. The large fish, armored with bony plates, traveled throughout North American waterways for millions of years, their fossil record going back to the time of the Tyrannosaurus rex. Sturgeon are ancient and tough. If they weren't as old, adapted, and developed, they probably would not have continued to survive as time and human impacts continue to affect the species' population and habitat. Despite its perseverance, the white sturgeon, native and unique to northwest Montana for millions of years, was listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 1994. 30 years later, the effort to save them continues. On the front lines of the restoration efforts is the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho. Since 1989, the tribe has been producing sturgeon in a hatchery and releasing them into the Kootenai River system.
Tell me a little bit more about kind of why the need to conserve the sturgeon is something that the tribe's passionate about, that you're passionate about.
The Kootenai Tribe of Idaho have a covenant with the Creator, and so that is to protect the environment, the fish, the wildlife, and everything, in these lands. And the sturgeon have cultural and historical significance because they are a long-lived species, and they're a very large species and prominent, and they're the apex predator of the ecosystem. They're considered like a teacher, to the tribe, and being that they are at the top of the food chain, they're really important ecologically for the ecosystem.
The Kootenai white sturgeon is only found in about 170 river miles of the Kootenai River. The landlocked population is notably smaller than elsewhere in its range, yet still have been reported to be as heavy as 350 pounds and 10 feet long in British Columbia. The population of sturgeon is one of 18 known landlocked populations that occur in western North America, including Montana, Idaho, and Canada. The endangered designation is specific to the Kootenai cohort. They are also a unique population in Montana where they live in a very limited range. Their unique habitat and lifestyles have prevented their numbers from increasing. The Kootenai River population of white sturgeon has declined over the past 50 years, with only about 500 adults remaining, according to the Montana Field Guide.
And what's interesting about this specific area is that this is the spawning grounds for the sturgeon. So the sturgeon will reside in British Columbia in Kootenai Lake for years, and then make a spawning migration, and they come to Bonners Ferry, Idaho, essentially. And they'll spawn here over maybe a 2-month period.
Prior to the 1970s, there was very little information on sturgeon, according to Ryan Sylvester, a fisheries biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The assumption was made that there were not an abundant fish based on how uncommon they were to catch. At one point before they were listed as endangered, there were as few as 10 white sturgeon predicted to be in the Kootenai River. The fish have low recruitment rates, meaning that there are rarely new additions to the population.
The spawning itself actually takes place over a really narrow window, maybe a 2-week window, and it's based on the hydrograph, so the flows at that certain time of year, the temperature, all those conditions, those environmental conditions are super important for the recruitment of sturgeon, but for their spawning behavior to come here, and then the adults will spawn and then leave and go back to the lake and recondition, and they'll do that intermittently. The females don't spawn every year, so females only spawn every 3 to 7 years, on average about 4. They'll return to spawn. The males can spawn each year. They kind of behave differently, So that's one of the tricky things about sturgeon is that they don't spawn every year. When they do spawn, they're subject to the environmental conditions of that year, and then like the actual natural recruitment, has to depend on the temperature and the flows and the substrate over which they spawn, and the eggs adhere to, and then the early life stages. That first year of survival is really critical, where they have to essentially endure whatever the river conditions are of that year or that spring, and then start to feed. And the Kootenai River system is really limited on nutrients, primarily because of the nutrient sink behind Libby Dam upstream of us. So what happens there is the nutrients are trapped behind the dam and aren't transported down through, which is needed for primary productivity. And so for those early life stages, those first few weeks of life, they need that food that's just not present. And so that's one of the major issues with the system. It's just very nutrient limited. The females don't spawn every year. So females only spawn every 3 to 7 years, on average about 4. They'll return to spawn. The males can spawn each year. They kind of behave differently. So that's one of the tricky things about sturgeon is that they don't spawn every year. When they do spawn, they're subject to the environmental conditions of that year, and then like the actual natural recruitment has to depend on the temperature and the flows and the substrate over which they spawn, and the eggs adhere to, and then the early life stages. That first year of survival is really critical, where they have to essentially endure whatever the river conditions are of that year or that spring, and then start to feed.
The tribe's project is set up on the designated spawning grounds of the Kootenai River, a stretch of water where sturgeon migrate every year to lay their eggs. Of the thousands of eggs that will be created, only less than 1% will survive their first year.
What caused that flip for them to stop being able to reproduce for themselves?
There's a lot of factors that go into natural recruitment and survival. One thought is that because the dam went into place, we don't have these very large scouring flow scenarios that would have cleaned off the substrate for the early life stages. So now those substrates are still there. It's just that they're covered in sand and silt. So the sturgeon know to come spawn here, and they do spawn, but the eggs don't land on the right cobble or substrate to incubate. And then when they hatch, the sac fry don't move into the interstitial spaces that were once there, or could be there if the flows were high enough, to where they could hide and develop and absorb their yolk sac. And then you have the lack of productivity. So the food is not there once they begin feeding. So you have to have the adults come to the right spot to spawn. The eggs have to be fertilized, because they're a broadcast spawner. They just let the ova go, and the sperm from the males are just let go, and in the middle of the river, essentially, in the right spot though. And then those eggs have to fall into the right substrate and then incubate, hatch, and then those swim up, sac fry, need to move into the area with the food that they need to start feeding and growing. And that's the trick, that first year of develop. And really you can whittle it down to about the first 3 to 4 weeks post-fertilization.
So it's just another kind of example of how
It's
multiple factors.
And it's those most fragile early life stages that are most vulnerable, which makes sense. And they're a highly fecund species. They do have an average over 100,000 eggs per female or can be released on average. So they're highly fecund. So that's, with a species like that, it's expected that you're going to have high rates of mortality at those early life stages. But usually some of those will survive.
Do you know, is there like a percentage or a stat for how many currently are surviving past those first 3 or 4 weeks out there naturally?
It's very low.
Okay.
Less than 1%.
Wow, okay.
Almost not even measurable
Okay.
on some years.
And has that increased, decreased, or kind of stayed the same over the past?
It's been pretty much the same since mid-70s.
Okay.
That natural recruitment is just non-existent.
Yeah.
When the sturgeon was listed in 1994, the Fish and Wildlife Commission established a recovery team to devise methods to protect or increase the population. One issue they found was the Libby Dam and other infrastructures seemingly lowering the sturgeon's overall population. Almost no recruitment has occurred since Libby Dam began regulating the Kootenai River, the field guide states. When the Libby Dam was first powered in 1972, the hydrograph was completely reversed, causing an unnatural ecological switch for river species, according to Greg Hoffman, a senior fisheries biologist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There wasn't a thought back in the 70s. This is right when the ESA was first written. People didn't consider effects on species when they were building hydropower, Hoffman said.
So the early to mid-70s is when the construction of the dam occurred and began operation. And basically it changed the hydrograph. And so it was being operated for quite some time, essentially a decade, where there were higher flows in the winter, lower flows in the springtime. There was not a lot known about the sturgeon and their behavior at that time. They were being studied, they were being monitored, and the last known successful recruitment year was 1974. And we still encounter those fish today at low levels. And so that's kind of our mark where we know that successful recruitment happened in 1974. So we've gone back and tried to figure out what those conditions were in 1974 with the flows. And they're very different than they are now with the hydropower system.
What would have happened with the fish, do you think, if the Libby Dam was never made?
We would still have those, high spring floods. The spawning substrate would probably be clean. It would be more suitable for them to naturally recruit. There wouldn't be the lack of nutrients throughout this lower part of the system below the dam to help stimulate the food web. Mm-hmm. Now, alternatively, if the hatchery program, the conservation aquaculture program, would not have been initiated with the tribe's foresight to act when they did, we would be watching the wild population just disappear and age out.
So we'd be watching an extinction practically?
Within 25 years, you would probably see extinction.
Wow.
The dam now operates to provide flows and mimic natural cycles, and is required to follow operative biological opinions. We may never see sturgeon recruitment. It's not a rosy picture, but what we can fix and improve, and I think operationally we are, from the Libby Dam perspective, trying to operate at an ecological function. It's a key leg in the Columbia River Treaty, Hoffman said. Recovery of the white sturgeon is contingent on reestablishing recruitment, enhancing genetic variability, and mitigating natural and physical altercations that limit the population. The White Sturgeon Recovery Plan, composed in 1999 by the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, recommends augmenting spring flows, implementing an aquaculture program, and reestablishing suitable habitat conditions to raise numbers. While the harvest of white sturgeon closed in 1979 in Montana, and the federal listing of them 30 years ago helped prevent the species from extinction, not much has changed over the past 40 to 45 years, Sylvester said. For them to be downlisted to threatened rather than endangered, increased recruitment is essential, Sylvester said. I see it being successful, but I don't see an end to the hatchery system at this time, Jensen said. For downlisting to occur, increased recruitment and reproduction need to happen on a meaningful scale, Jensen said.
It's a very important part of the ecological balance of the system. They've been here for a very, very long time, millennia. They're critical to the health of this environment. It's important to the tribe, to the people. It's a success story. It's ongoing. Again, this is like the tribe's foresight to know that there was a problem and that something had to be done, And for them to focus and start this program was absolutely critical, and it didn't come easy. There was a lot of resistance, and they knew better, and we're starting to see, the positive result of their knowledge.
The fight to protect the white sturgeon, although currently localized in northwest Montana, may continue to get attention across its home waters. Last year, groups in California petitioned to list the Californian white sturgeon as threatened under the ESA. The petition states that the recruitment of California sturgeon has decreased since the 1980s, and reproduction has been impaired by water diversion and reservoir storage, similar to the Kootenai population. According to Sylvester, there are current hatchery and larval releases to expand the population underway to help the natural population reproduce on their own. If scientists can ultimately reach juvenile reproduction targets, he said, the downlisting or delisting process would be an option. While decades of work and research have gone into protecting this endangered fish, scientists look to more decades of that work. It's a long game, Sylvester said, but thanks to the Endangered Species Act and the protections it awards, there is some glimmer of a chance.
To read Kate's stories in full, visit dailyinterlake.com.